Sometimes, the most profound bonds are forged in the most unexpected moments. In the harsh wilderness of 1800s Montana, one man's simple act of kindness would change everything. When Jacob Henley, a struggling cowboy barely scraping by, discovered two tiny wolf pups whimpering beside their dead mother, he faced an impossible choice. Walk away and let nature take its course, or risk everything to save them. Against all warnings from the townspeople, Jacob wrapped the pups in his worn coat and took them home. What happened next would test the limits of loyalty and prove that unlikely families can become the strongest. But when real danger finally arrived at Jacob's small door, would these wolves stand by the man who saved them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Montana Territory, painting the rugged landscape in shades of amber and gold. Jacob Henley stood on the weathered porch of his small ranch house, cradling a steaming cup of coffee between his calloused hands. At 32, he carried the weight of a man twice his age in the lines around his eyes and the careful way he moved his shoulders, stiff from years of hard labor and sleeping on thin bedrolls under unforgiving skies. His ranch, if it could truly be called that, consisted of 40 acres of stubborn grassland, a handful of cattle that seemed more interested in wandering than staying put, and a house his father had built with his own hands 20 years prior. The structure stood modest but solid, its weathered pine boards bearing witness to countless storms and seasons. Jacob had grown up within these walls, learning the rhythm of ranch life from a man who believed in the dignity of honest work and the importance of keeping your word. The rifle mounted above the stone fireplace had belonged to his father, Thomas Henley, a man who had carved out this small piece of the frontier with nothing but determination and an unwavering moral compass. Thomas had passed 3 winters ago, leaving behind more debt than cattle and a son who inherited his sense of duty along with his struggles. The Winchester rifle remained untouched in its place of honor, its brass fittings polished weekly despite Jacob's reluctance to use it for anything beyond hunting the occasional deer that wandered too close to his meager vegetable garden. Jacob's nearest neighbors lived 7 miles away in Cedar Ridge, a town that had sprouted around a trading post and grown into a community of 200 souls, all trying to make their mark on this unforgiving land. The town boasted a general store run by Harold Whitman, a man whose generosity often outweighed his business sense, a small church where Reverend Patterson delivered sermons that somehow always related to the weather or cattle prices, and a saloon that served as the unofficial town hall for settling disputes and spreading news. The relationship between Jacob and the townspeople had always been cordial but distant. His father's reputation for fairness and reliability had earned the Henley name respect, but Jacob's natural tendency towards solitude and his struggles to maintain the ranch had gradually isolated him from the community's daily rhythms. He made his monthly trips to town for supplies and attended church services when the mood struck him, but he found himself increasingly comfortable with the silence of his own land and the company of his few remaining cattle. This particular morning carried an unusual weight, as 2 tiny bundles of fur slept peacefully in a makeshift bed near his kitchen stove. The wolf pups had arrived in his life just 3 days prior, and already they had disrupted every routine he had established over the past 3 years of bachelor living. They required feeding every few hours with milk he could barely afford, warming by the fire that consumed precious firewood, and constant vigilance to ensure they didn't wander into harm's way. The decision to save them had been entirely instinctual. Jacob had been riding his northern boundary, checking for breaks in his fence line when he heard the whimpering. Following the sound, he had discovered the scene that would change everything. A magnificent grey wolf, clearly the mother, lying motionless beside a fallen log. 2 tiny pups, no larger than his fist, crying beside her still form. The mother showed Signs of a struggle, perhaps with a bear or mountain cat, her final moments spent protecting her young. Standing there in the fading afternoon light, Jacob had faced a choice that seemed to encapsulate every difficult decision of his adult life. The practical part of his mind, the voice that sounded remarkably like his father's, reminded him that wolves were predators, that raising them was dangerous folly, that he could barely feed himself, let alone two wild animals that would grow into creatures capable of killing his cattle. Yet something deeper, perhaps the same instinct that had driven his father to help struggling neighbors despite his own limited resources, compelled him to act. He had wrapped the pups in his worn leather coat, the same coat that had sheltered him through countless cold nights and represented one of his few possessions with real value. The garment had become their first shelter, absorbing their scent and beginning the bonding process that Jacob didn't yet understand, but somehow trusted. The past 3 days had been a revelation in patience and improvisation. He had managed to get them to accept milk from a bottle fashioned from her old leather glove, warming it carefully over the stove and testing the temperature against his wrist as he had seen mothers do with human babies. They slept curled together, their tiny bodies generating warmth and comfort for each other, occasionally twitching in dreams that Jacob imagined filled with memories of their lost mother. During their waking hours, they displayed personalities as distinct as any two human children. The slightly larger pup, whom Jacob had begun calling Storm for his darker coloring and more adventurous spirit, showed an early tendency to explore every corner of the kitchen and attempt to follow Jacob wherever he went. His smaller companion, lighter in color and more cautious in temperament, seemed content to observe from safe distances, earning the name Shadow for his tendency to find quiet corners and watch the world with intelligent amber eyes. Jacob's daily routine had adapted around their needs in ways that surprised him with their naturalness. He woke earlier to tend to them before beginning his ranch work, took shorter trips away from the house, and found himself speaking to them throughout the day as if they were capable of understanding his concerns about the failing fence posts, the need for rain, and his dwindling financial resources. The townspeople had learned of his unusual house guests through Harold Whitman, whose wife Emma had an uncanny ability to know everyone's business despite rarely leaving their store. Jacob's monthly supply run had coincided with the pup's arrival, and his purchase of additional milk and an old baby bottle had prompted questions he had answered with characteristic honesty. Emma's reaction, a mixture of fascination and horror, had been predictable, and Jacob knew that by sunset, every resident of Cedar Ridge would know that Jacob Henley was attempting to raise wild wolves. The reactions had been swift and varied. Reverend Patterson had stopped by the following evening, ostensibly to check on Jacob's spiritual well-being, but clearly motivated by curiosity and concern. He had viewed the sleeping pups with the careful attention of a man accustomed to weighing moral complexities, eventually offering the observation that God worked in mysterious ways and sometimes called upon people to show mercy in unexpected forms. Less philosophical had been the visit from Sheriff Morrison, a man whose 10 years in law enforcement had taught him to view most situations through the lens of potential trouble. Morrison was a fair man in his way, but he approached problems with the practical mindset of someone responsible for maintaining order in a community where disputes could escalate quickly, and justice often had to be administered without the benefit of higher authorities. The sheriff had examined the pups with professional skepticism, noting their size and estimating their age, while explaining the various ways that raising wolves could endanger Jacob, his neighbors, and the community at large. His concerns were valid and delivered without malice, but they carried the weight of authority and the implicit suggestion that Jacob's experiment in wildlife rehabilitation might need to end sooner rather than later. Other visitors had been less diplomatic. Martha Prescott, whose husband owned the largest ranch in the county, had made her position clear without the courtesy of an actual visit, sending word through her foreman that wolves on the Henley property would not be tolerated if they posed any threat to the Prescott cattle. Given that her ranch adjoined Jacob's northern boundary, her concerns held particular weight, and the implicit threat of more serious consequences if the situation escalated. Despite the mounting pressure from various quarters, Jacob found himself more committed to his unlikely charges with each passing day. Their dependence on him was complete and touching in ways he hadn't anticipated. When he returned from his daily chores, their excited greeting expressed through enthusiastic tail, wagging and attempts to climb his legs with their tiny claws provided a warmth that had been absent from his life since his father's death. More intriguingly, he was beginning to observe behaviors that suggested intelligence beyond what he had expected from such young animals. They responded to their names consistently, showed preferences for different foods, and demonstrated problem-solving, abilities that impressed him daily. Storm had figured out how to open the simple latch on the box that served as their bed, while Shadow had learned to signal his needs by sitting quietly beside Jacob's chair and maintaining eye contact until attention was given. The financial reality of his situation remained pressing. His cattle operation generated barely enough income to cover basic expenses, and the additional costs of feeding and caring for the pups strained his already tight budget. He had been forced to defer payment on his account at Whitman's store, adding to a debt that kept him awake at night, calculating possible solutions that seemed increasingly elusive. Yet each morning brought small victories that made the difficulties seem manageable. The pups were growing stronger, their coordination improving, and their trust in Jacob deepening in ways that felt like a privilege he had somehow earned through consistency and gentleness. He began to envision a future where they might serve as companions and protectors, earning their keep through loyalty and usefulness rather than remaining merely dependent creatures requiring constant care. As the sun reached its zenith on this particular day, Jacob prepared for another trip to town, this time to face the questions and concerns of his neighbors with greater confidence in his decision. The pups were thriving under his care, showing no signs of the aggressive tendencies that worried the townspeople, and he was beginning to understand their individual personalities and needs in ways that made their care feel less like an impossible burden and more like a worthwhile investment in an uncertain future. Standing once more on his porch, Jacob watched Storm and Shadow explore the small yard he had enclosed for their safety, their playful interactions reminding him of the simple joy that existed in the world despite its many hardships. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he had committed himself to their well-being, and that commitment felt like the first truly important decision he had made since his father's death. 2 weeks later, the fragile peace surrounding Jacob's unusual household shattered like glass dropped on stone. The trouble began, as most troubles do, with good intentions and poor timing. Jacob had brought Storm and Shadow into town for the first time, reasoning that their growing size and increasing activity made isolation from human contact unwise. If they were to live in a world shared with people, they needed to learn human ways and human sense. He had fashioned simple rope leads and loaded them into his wagon, planning a brief visit to Whitman's store during the quiet mid-morning hours when foot traffic would be minimal. The plan had seemed sound. Storm and Shadow, now the size of medium dogs and showing the intelligence that had impressed Jacob daily, had accepted the leads without struggle and appeared curious rather than frightened by the wagon ride. Their golden eyes took in the changing landscape with alert interest, and they responded to Jacob's quiet voice with the attention he had come to expect from them. Main Street in Cedar Ridge stretched for 3 blocks, lined with the practical buildings that served the community's needs. The general store occupied the most prominent position at the street center, flanked by the barber shop, the small office that served as both bank and telegraph station, and Murphy's saloon. Across the street stood the church, the schoolhouse, and several modest homes belonging to the town's established families. Jacob's arrival with his unusual companions coincided with the emergence of several townspeople from various establishments, and within moments, what should have been a simple supply run had transformed into an impromptu town gathering. Word spread with the efficiency that characterizes small communities, and soon a cluster of curious and concerned residents had formed. Around Jacob's wagon, the wolves, for their part, handled the attention with remarkable composure. Storm, true to his adventurous nature, attempted to greet the gathering crowd with tail wags and the curious sniffing that had become his standard approach to new experiences. Shadow remained closer to Jacob, alert but not fearful, his intelligent gaze moving from face to face as if cataloguing each person for future reference. "Jacob Henley, what in the Lord's name do you think you're doing?" The voice belonged to Martha Prescott, whose substantial presence and forceful personality made her the unofficial spokesperson for conservative opinion in Cedar Ridge. She had arrived via carriage with her daughter Rebecca, and both women stared at the wolves with expressions that mixed fascination with unmistakable horror. "Just bringing Storm and Shadow to meet folks, Mrs. Prescott," Jacob replied evenly, maintaining the calm tone he had learned to use when discussing his wolves. "Figured if they're going to be living here, they ought to know their neighbors." "Living here?" The question came from Dr. Matthews, whose medical training had given him a scientific curiosity about Jacob's experiment. "Jacob, those are wild animals. They belong in the wilderness, not in a civilized community." Before Jacob could respond, Storm made the decision that would change everything. A small child, perhaps 4 years old, had wandered too close to the wagon, despite his mother's attempts to restrain him. The boy's natural fascination with animals overcame his fear, and he reached toward Storm with the innocent trust that characterizes young children. Storm, interpreting the gesture as an invitation to play, jumped from the wagon and approached the child with enthusiasm. His size, now substantial enough to knock down a small person, and his wolf-like appearance created a scene that looked to frightened observers like an attack in progress. The child's mother screamed. Several men reached for weapons they carried. Out of frontier habit, Martha Prescott's voice rose above the commotion, demanding that someone shoot the beast before it killed the boy. In the space of 3 heartbeats, panic had transformed a moment of innocent interaction into a crisis that threatened everything Jacob had worked to build. "Nobody moves." Jacob's voice cut through the chaos with an authority that surprised even him. He vaulted from the wagon seat and positioned himself between Storm and the gathering crowd, one hand raised to calm the people, while the other gestured for the wolf to return to his side. Storm, responding to Jacob's command with the obedience that had developed through weeks of patient training, immediately retreated to Jacob's left side and sat, his tail wagging, and his expression still friendly despite the hostile atmosphere that had erupted around him. The child, unharmed and seemingly unaware of the panic his interaction had caused, continued to reach toward the wolf with undiminished curiosity. "He's just friendly," Jacob said, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "Look at him. He's not showing any aggression. He just wanted to say hello." Sheriff Morrison arrived at that moment, drawn by the commotion and the reports that had reached him at his office 2 blocks away. His presence immediately shifted the dynamic of the confrontation, as his badge represented the authority to resolve disputes through official action rather than mob emotion. Morrison was a careful man who had learned to assess situations before acting. But the scene before him presented complexities that challenged his usual methodical approach. On one side stood Jacob Henley, a man he respected for his honesty and his father's reputation, accompanied by 2 animals that were undeniably wolves, despite their apparent docility. On the other side, a crowd of concerned citizens whose fears, while perhaps exaggerated, were not entirely unreasonable given the frontier's harsh realities. Jacob, Morrison said, his voice carrying the measured tone of authority. "I think we need to have a serious conversation about this situation." "I'm willing to talk, Sheriff," Jacob replied, maintaining his protective position between the wolves and the crowd. "But I won't have them hurt for being friendly." The sheriff's gaze moved from Jacob to the wolves, taking in their size, their alertness, and their apparent responsiveness to Jacob's commands. His law enforcement experience had taught him to distinguish between genuine threats and perceived ones, but he also understood that public perception could become reality in communities, where fear spread faster than facts. "Here's what's going to happen," Morrison announced, addressing both Jacob and the crowd with equal authority. "We're going to have a town meeting tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock in the church hall. Everyone who has concerns about this situation can speak their piece, and Jacob can explain his position. Then we'll figure out what's best for everyone involved." Martha Prescott stepped forward, her voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. "Sheriff, those are wild animals. There's nothing to discuss. They need to be removed before someone gets hurt." "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern," Morrison replied diplomatically, "but we do things according to law and custom in this town. Jacob has the right to speak for himself, and the community has the right to express its concerns through proper channels." The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, conversations continuing in small groups as people processed what they had witnessed. Jacob loaded Storm and Shadow back into his wagon, completing his supply run with the efficient movements of a man eager to leave an uncomfortable situation behind. As he prepared to depart, Sheriff Morrison approached the wagon privately. "Jacob, I want you to understand something. I've got nothing personal against you or your wolves, but my job is to keep peace in this community. If people think those animals are dangerous, that becomes my problem, whether they actually are or not." Jacob nodded, recognizing the position the sheriff found himself in. "I understand, Sheriff, but they're not dangerous. They're just different." "Different can be dangerous in a place like this," Morrison replied, his hand resting unconsciously on his badge as he spoke. "People here have lost livestock to wolves, lost friends to wild animals. Their fears aren't completely unreasonable." "Then maybe it's time they learned that not all wolves are the same," Jacob said, gathering his reins. As Jacob's wagon rolled out of town, Storm and Shadow settled beside him with the contentment of creatures returning home after an adventure. But the tension that had erupted so suddenly on Main Street followed them like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. That evening, as Jacob fed his unusual family and reflected on the day's events, he realized that tomorrow's meeting would determine more than just the fate of two orphaned wolves. It would test whether a community could expand its understanding of what belonged within its boundaries, and whether one man's act of compassion could survive the collective fears of his neighbors. The confrontation had revealed the fragility of the acceptance he thought he had been building, and the speed with which fear could transform neighbors into adversaries. Sheriff Morrison's badge, symbol of the law and order that held their community together, now represented the force that might separate Jacob from the creatures that had become his family. The town meeting was still 2 days away, but Jacob had no intention of waiting passively for others to decide his fate. If the community needed proof that Storm and Shadow could coexist safely with humans, he would provide that evidence through training and preparation that demonstrated their intelligence and responsiveness to human guidance. He began before dawn, working with the wolves in the enclosed area behind his house where their activities would remain private until he felt confident in their progress. The morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn, and the wolves seemed energized by the cooler temperatures and the focused attention Jacob was giving them. Training wild animals required an entirely different approach than the methods he had used with cattle dogs in his youth. Storm and Shadow possessed an intelligence that seemed to anticipate his intentions, but they also retained instincts that could surface unpredictably. Jacob found himself learning their language as much as teaching them his. Storm responded well to vocal commands delivered in calm, consistent tones. Stay, accompanied by a raised palm, became his first reliable response, followed quickly by come, paired with Jacob's beckoning gesture. The wolf's eagerness to please surprised Jacob with its intensity, as if Storm understood that mastering these lessons carried importance beyond simple obedience. Shadow required more patience and a gentler approach. His cautious nature made him observe before acting, but once he understood what was expected, his compliance was absolute. Jacob discovered that Shadow responded better to subtle signals than vocal commands, developing a communication style based on eye contact and body language that felt almost mystical in its effectiveness. The breakthrough came on the second morning, when Jacob realized he needed a tool to communicate across distances. Working with his pocket knife and a piece of seasoned maple from his woodpile, he carved a simple whistle designed to produce the high-pitched tones that seemed to capture the wolves' attention most effectively. The whistle took him 3 hours to complete, shaped and hollowed with the careful attention of a man who understood that precision mattered. When he tested it, the sound carried clearly across his 40 acres, a pure note that seemed to resonate with something deep in the wolf's nature. Storm's reaction was immediate and dramatic. His head snapped toward the sound, ears erect and focused, before he bounded across the yard to Jacob's side with an enthusiasm that suggested the whistle had activated some primal recognition. Shadow's response was more measured but equally definitive, approaching with purposeful steps and positioning himself at Jacob's right side without any additional command. Over the following hours, Jacob developed a simple code using the whistle. One sharp blast meant, "Come immediately." 2 short notes signaled, "Stay alert, but remain where you are." 3 quick bursts served as a recall command from any distance. The wolves learned these signals with remarkable speed, as if they had been waiting for a communication method that bridged their world and his. The training sessions revealed aspects of their personalities that Jacob found both fascinating and concerning. Storm displayed protective instincts that bordered on aggressive when strangers approached the property. The wolf had already shown suspicion toward the mail carrier and the traveling preacher who made monthly visits to isolated ranches. While Storm never displayed actual hostility, his alert posture and focused attention on potential threats made it clear that he considered himself Jacob's guardian. Shadow demonstrated different but equally impressive abilities. His capacity for silent movement and observation had reached levels that sometimes startled Jacob when the wolf appeared suddenly beside him after apparently being elsewhere entirely. Shadow seemed to understand the importance of remaining unseen, positioning himself in shadows and behind cover with an instinctive understanding of concealment that suggested natural hunting prowess. Together, they began to function as a coordinated team. When Jacob worked on fence repairs in his distant pastures, Storm would maintain a perimeter around the work area while Shadow scouted ahead, investigating anything unusual before returning to signal whether it warranted attention. Their coordination required no training from Jacob. It seemed to emerge from their wolf nature and their acceptance of him as pack leader. The financial pressures that had worried Jacob for months began to ease as he realized the wolves' potential value beyond companionship. Storm's protective presence had already deterred 2 incidents that might have cost him livestock. A bear that had been raiding chicken coops throughout the valley had approached Jacob's property once, taken one look at Storm's alert stance and threatening growl, and moved on to easier targets. More significantly, the wolves had detected evidence of human intrusion on his property that Jacob would never have noticed. Strange boot prints near his water source, disturbed vegetation that suggested someone had been watching his house from concealment, and other subtle signs that pointed to surveillance by unknown parties. This discovery troubled Jacob more than he cared to admit. The frontier attracted men who lived outside the law, and isolated ranches like his provided tempting targets for those who preferred taking what others had built rather than building for themselves. His father had faced similar threats and had dealt with them through a combination of vigilance and community cooperation that Jacob was beginning to realize he might not be able to replicate. The wolves' alertness to these intrusions provided security that Jacob couldn't have afforded to hire, but it also raised questions about who might be watching his property and why. The timing seemed too coincidental with his public confrontation in town, suggesting that his troubles might extend beyond community disapproval into more serious territory. During his evening sessions with Storm and Shadow, Jacob began incorporating scenarios that might arise during the town meeting. He practiced commands that would demonstrate their obedience, worked on their response to crowds and noise, and developed signals that would allow him to control their behavior even in stressful situations. The wolves adapted to these exercises with impressive flexibility, as if they understood that their future depended on convincing skeptical humans of their trustworthiness. Storm learned to remain calm when children approached, suppressing his natural enthusiasm for play in favor of dignified restraint. Shadow perfected his already impressive ability to remain motionless and nearly invisible, understanding that his presence should be reassuring rather than threatening. As the day of the town meeting approached, Jacob felt cautiously optimistic about his ability to address the community's concerns through demonstration rather than argument. The wolves had proven themselves capable of remarkable discipline and intelligence, responding to commands with reliability that exceeded anything he had expected when he first wrapped them in his coat. Yet the strange signs around his property continued to multiply, suggesting that the town meeting might be the least of his problems. Someone was taking an interest in his ranch that went beyond mere curiosity, and the wolves' increasingly alert behavior suggested that threats more serious than community disapproval might be approaching his small sanctuary in the Montana wilderness. The whistle he had carved became his constant companion, hanging from a leather cord around his neck as both tool and symbol of the unique partnership he had forged with his unlikely family. Whatever challenges awaited them, they would face them together, united by bonds that transcended the traditional boundaries between human and wild nature. Sarah Mitchell arrived at Jacob's ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, driving her small buggy with the confident ease of a woman accustomed to navigating frontier roads independently. She had sent no word of her intended visit, but Jacob recognized her approach from a distance by the purposeful way she handled her horse and the straight line she took across the prairie, rather than following the meandering path most visitors used. As the schoolteacher in Cedar Ridge, Sarah occupied a unique position in the community's social hierarchy. She possessed the education and refinement that frontier towns valued but often struggled to attract, yet she maintained practical skills that earned respect from the hard-working families who entrusted their children to her care. At 28, she had chosen to remain unmarried, despite receiving several proposals from eligible men in the territory, declaring her independence through work that provided both purpose and financial security. Jacob watched her arrival with the mixture of curiosity and caution that had characterized his interactions with townspeople since the confrontation on Main Street. Sarah had not been present during that incident, but he assumed she had heard the various accounts that had circulated through Cedar Ridge, with the efficiency of all small-town gossip. Storm and Shadow detected her approach long before Jacob's. Human senses registered the sound of her buggy wheels. Both wolves positioned themselves alertly beside Jacob as he emerged from his house to greet his unexpected visitor, their body language watchful but not threatening. Jacob noted their restraint with satisfaction, recognizing it as evidence of their growing ability to distinguish between different types of human approach. "Miss Mitchell," Jacob said, touching the brim of his hat as she brought her buggy to a stop near his front porch. "This is an unexpected pleasure." "Mr. Henley," she replied, her voice carrying the clear diction that marked her education, while maintaining warmth that suggested genuine friendliness. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to meet your famous companions before passing judgment on them." Her direct approach impressed Jacob immediately. Most visitors either avoided mentioning the wolves entirely or launched into lengthy explanations of their concerns. Sarah's straightforward acknowledgement of her purpose eliminated the awkward pretense that characterized most social interactions since his return from town. "Storm, Shadow," Jacob called quietly, using the tone that had become their signal for formal introductions. Both wolves approached with the controlled dignity they had been practicing, stopping at Jacob's side and sitting without requiring additional commands. Sarah studied them with the careful attention of someone accustomed to evaluating children's behavior for signs of character and potential. Her gaze moved from their alert expressions to their responsive posture, taking in details that casual observers might miss. Jacob found himself holding his breath as he waited for her assessment. "There, beautiful," she said finally, stepping down from her buggy with movements that were graceful but not hesitant, "and much more intelligent than I expected." "Most people see the wolf first and never get past that," Jacob replied, surprised by the relief in his own voice. "Most people don't work with children," Sarah said, approaching slowly with her hands visible and her posture non-threatening. "Intelligence shows in the eyes, regardless of the species." Storm, ever the more social of the two wolves, responded to her calm approach with cautious interest. His tail began a tentative wagging motion as Sarah extended her hand for him to investigate, allowing him to process her scent before attempting any direct contact. Shadow remained more reserved, watching the interaction with alert attention. While maintaining his position beside Jacob, "He's deciding whether to trust you," Jacob observed, noting Storm's careful evaluation of Sarah's intentions. "As he should," Sarah replied, remaining perfectly still while Storm completed his assessment. "Trust should be earned, not assumed." When Storm finally accepted her presence by gently touching his nose to her extended hand, Sarah's smile transformed her entire face. Jacob found himself studying that smile with more attention than politeness strictly required, noting how it reached her eyes and created small lines at their corners that suggested she smiled often, despite the serious nature of her profession. "May I?" she asked, indicating her desire to pet Storm more fully. "He'll let you know," Jacob said, watching as Storm made his decision by moving closer to Sarah and positioning himself within easy reach of her hands. Sarah's touch was gentle but confident, stroking Storm's thick coat with the assured movements of someone comfortable with animals. Her response to Shadow was even more impressive. Recognizing his more cautious nature, she made no attempt to approach him directly, but instead spoke to him in quiet tones while maintaining her focus on Storm, allowing Shadow to observe and decide for himself whether she warranted his attention. "I brought something," Sarah said, reaching into the small bag she carried. From it, she produced a silver locket that caught the afternoon sunlight as it swung from a delicate chain. "It belonged to my grandmother. She always said it brought good fortune to those who needed protection." Jacob examined the locket with curious interest. Its surface bore an intricate engraving of a woman surrounded by various animals, all rendered in miniature detail that spoke of skilled craftsmanship. The image suggested harmony between human and wild nature rather than the dominance that characterized most frontier attitudes toward animals. "It's beautiful," Jacob said, "but I couldn't accept something so personal." "It's not for you," Sarah replied with a smile that carried gentle amusement. "It's for them, or rather, for what they represent." She fastened the locket's chain around Storm's neck, adjusting it so that it lay comfortably against his chest without restricting his movement. Storm accepted this decoration with remarkable tolerance, as if he understood that it carried significance beyond mere ornamentation. My grandmother lived alone in Ohio for 30 years after my grandfather died, Sarah explained as she stepped back to admire the effect. She had a wolf hybrid that someone abandoned as a pup, and it was her closest companion through all those years. The townspeople thought she was crazy, but that animal probably saved her life a dozen times over. Jacob felt something shift in his chest as he listened to her story, a recognition that perhaps his situation was not as unusual or impossible as others had suggested. What happened to them? They died within a month of each other, Sarah said. Quietly, Grandmother always said they would, that they were too connected to survive separation. The implication of her story was not lost on Jacob, nor was the symbolism of the locket now resting against Storm's chest. Sarah was offering more than just moral support. She was suggesting that bonds between human and animal could transcend social convention and survive community opposition. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah demonstrated a natural ease with both wolves that impressed Jacob deeply. She spoke to them as individuals, recognized their different personalities, and responded to their behaviors with understanding that seemed intuitive rather than learned. Shadow eventually approached her on his own initiative, drawn by her patient acceptance rather than forced interaction. When she prepared to leave as evening approached, the wolves seemed reluctant to see her go. Storm followed her buggy for several yards before responding to Jacob's recall whistle, while Shadow watched her departure from the porch with alert attention that suggested he would remember her visit long after she had disappeared from view. "Will you be at the town meeting?" Jacob asked as she gathered her reins. "I wouldn't miss it," Sarah replied, her hand moving unconsciously to touch a simple silver chain at her throat, as if the gesture provided reassurance. "And Jacob, don't let them make you doubt what you're doing here. Some bonds are worth fighting." As her buggy disappeared into the growing dusk, Jacob realized that the locket gleaming against Storm's chest had become a symbol of hope that extended far beyond protection for the wolves. It represented the possibility that understanding could triumph over fear, and that he might not have to face the challenges ahead entirely alone. The town meeting had not gone as Jacob had hoped. Despite Sarah's support and the controlled demonstration of the wolves' obedience, the community's verdict had been mixed at best. A narrow majority had voted to allow Jacob to keep Storm and Shadow under strict conditions. They must remain on his property at all times. Any incident involving the wolves would result in their immediate removal, and Jacob would bear full legal and financial responsibility for any damage they might cause. While the decision represented a victory of sorts, it also isolated Jacob more completely than before. Those who had supported the wolves were few, and those who had opposed them viewed the community's compromise as dangerous weakness. The division had created factions that eyed each other with suspicion and resentment, transforming neighborly disagreements into something approaching hostility. The harassment began 3 days later. Jacob discovered it when he rode out to check. His northern fence line, the boundary that separated his small ranch from the Prescott holdings. A section of fence posts that had stood solid for 15 years lay in charred ruins, burned sometime during the night while Jacob slept. The destruction was thorough and deliberate, designed not just to damage his property, but to send a clear message about the consequences of defying community sentiment. Storm and Shadow accompanied Jacob as he surveyed the damage, their behavior, immediately alerting him to details he might have missed. Both wolves investigated the burned area with intense interest, their sensitive noses detecting scents that human senses could not register. Storm's hackles rose as he processed information from the ground around the destruction, while Shadow circled the perimeter with the systematic attention of a tracker following a trail. The burn pattern told its own story. Whoever had done this had come prepared with accelerant and tools, working efficiently to maximize damage while minimizing their exposure to discovery. They had also chosen their target carefully. This particular fence section, protected Jacob's most vulnerable pasture, where his remaining cattle gathered near the seasonal creek that provided their primary water source. More disturbing than the destruction itself were the implications for his livestock's safety and his property's security. Without the fence, his cattle could wander onto Prescott land, creating disputes that would inevitably favor his more powerful neighbor. More seriously, the burn section created an opening that would allow predators or rustlers easy access to his herd during the vulnerable night hours. Jacob spent the morning gathering materials for repairs, loading his wagon with posts, wire, and tools while the wolves maintained their alert watch. Their behavior suggested that the perpetrator's scent remained fresh enough to track, but Jacob resisted the temptation to pursue immediate confrontation. His father had taught him that frontier justice could escalate quickly beyond anyone's ability to control, and Jacob's precarious position in the community made restraint essential. The repair work proved more difficult than anticipated. The fire had damaged not only the posts, but also the metal hardware and wire that connected them, requiring complete reconstruction rather than simple replacement. As Jacob dug new post holes in the rocky soil, Storm and Shadow positioned themselves strategically around the work area, creating an early warning system that allowed Jacob to focus on his labor without constantly monitoring for threats. Their vigilance proved justified when Shadow's low growl alerted Jacob to approaching riders. 3 men on horseback were crossing the prairie from the direction of town, riding with the purposeful pace of people on official business rather than casual visitors. Jacob recognized them as they drew closer. Tom Bradley, who worked as foreman. For Martha Prescott, Carl Murphy, who owned the saloon and served as unofficial spokesman for the town's business interests, and Deputy Wheeler, whose presence gave the visit an air of legal authority. Jacob continued working as they approached, giving no indication that their arrival concerned him, while keeping the wolves close with subtle hand signals. Storm and Shadow responded by positioning themselves on either side of Jacob, alert but not aggressive, their presence serving as both protection and demonstration of their obedience to his commands. "Morning, Jacob," Deputy Wheeler called as the riders drew rein near the fence line. His tone carried careful neutrality, the voice of a man fulfilling duties he would prefer to avoid. "Deputy," Jacob replied, straightening from his work, but keeping his hands visible and his manner cooperative. "What brings you out here?" "Had some reports about trouble on your property," Wheeler explained, his gaze taking in the burned fence posts and Jacob's repair efforts. "Thought we should check it out. As you can see, I'm dealing with it," Jacob said evenly. "Some folks apparently didn't appreciate the town meeting's decision." Tom Bradley shifted in his saddle, his weathered face showing the skeptical expression that characterized his approach to most situations. "Mighty convenient, having your fence burn right where it would let your cattle onto Prescott land." The implication was clear and insulting. Bradley was suggesting that Jacob had burned his own fence to create an excuse for his cattle to trespass. Jacob felt anger rise in his chest, but forced his voice to remain calm and reasonable. "Tom, I've been repairing this fence since dawn. Does that look like the action of a man trying to let his cattle wander?" Carl Murphy, whose business interests made him sensitive to community tensions, attempted to mediate. "Nobody's accusing anybody of anything, Jacob. We're just trying to make sure there's no misunderstanding about what happened here." "What happened," Jacob said, gesturing toward the burned posts, "is that someone came onto my property in the night and destroyed my fence. I'd think that would concern you as much as it concerns me." Deputy Wheeler dismounted and walked closer to examine the burned area, his law enforcement training evident in the systematic way he studied the scene. Storm watched his approach with alert attention while maintaining his position beside Jacob, demonstrating the controlled response that had impressed Sarah Mitchell. "This was definitely set deliberately," Wheeler concluded after several minutes of investigation. "Multiple ignition points, accelerant residue, too much damage for an accidental fire." "So what are you going to do about it?" Jacob asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "File a report," Wheeler replied with obvious reluctance. "Ask around town. See if anybody noticed anything unusual last night." Jacob understood the futility of such investigations in a community where witnesses would be reluctant to implicate their neighbors, especially in a case involving the controversial wolves. The deputy's promise of investigation was sincere, but practically meaningless. As the riders prepared to leave, Tom Bradley delivered what was clearly the visit's primary message. "Jacob, Mrs. Prescott wants you to know that any of your cattle that wander onto her land will be impounded until you pay the damages and trespass. Fees. She's got every legal right to protect her property." The threat was delivered politely but unmistakably. Without the fence, Jacob's cattle were vulnerable to both genuine wandering and accusations of trespassing that could be manufactured as needed. The burned posts had created a trap that could be triggered whenever his enemies chose to spring. After the riders departed, Jacob continued his repairs with grim determination. The wolves seemed to sense his troubled mood, staying closer than usual and responding to his commands with particular attention. As he worked, Jacob reflected on how quickly his situation had deteriorated from community concern to active harassment. The burned fence posts stood as charred testimony to the reality that some of his neighbors viewed his wolves not just as a nuisance, but as a challenge to their authority that required elimination. The careful escalation of pressure suggested organized opposition rather than spontaneous anger, implying that more serious confrontations lay ahead. As evening approached and Jacob completed the temporary repairs that would protect his cattle, through the night, he realized that the burned posts represented more than property damage. They marked the beginning of a campaign designed to force him into surrender or departure, and the success of that campaign would determine whether the bonds he had forged with Storm and Shadow could survive the concentrated hostility of people who saw their existence as an unacceptable challenge to the established order. Sarah's visits had become a bright constant in Jacob's increasingly troubled world. She arrived each Thursday afternoon with books from her classroom, sharing stories about her students while helping Jacob understand Storm and Shadow's developing behaviors through the lens of her experience with young minds. Her presence had also become something more personal, creating moments of warmth that Jacob found himself anticipating with an intensity that surprised him. On this particular Thursday, Sarah noticed the wolves' agitated behavior before Jacob did. Storm paced restlessly around the yard, pausing frequently to test the air with focused attention, while Shadow maintained an alert watch from the porch steps, his golden eyes scanning the horizon with unusual intensity. "They're sensing something," Sarah observed, setting down the basket of supplies she'd brought from town. "Something that has them concerned." Jacob had learned to trust the wolves' instincts implicitly. Their senses detected threats and changes that his human awareness missed entirely, and their behavior had become his early warning system for trouble that might be approaching his small ranch. The current level of their alertness suggested something significant was happening beyond the range of his perception. "Let's take a ride," Jacob suggested, saddling his horse while the wolves continued their agitated surveillance. "They're trying to tell us something, and I've learned not to ignore their warnings." Sarah's agreement came without hesitation, though. Jacob noticed her hand move unconsciously to the small derringer she carried in her reticule, a practical precaution for a woman who often traveled alone in frontier territory. Her willingness to accompany him into potentially dangerous situations represented trust that Jacob valued more than he cared to examine closely. They rode toward the southern boundary of Jacob's property, following a route that would take them past the seasonal waterholes where neighboring ranchers often grazed their cattle during dry periods. Storm and Shadow flanked their horses, ranging ahead to investigate anything that caught their attention while maintaining contact through the whistle signals Jacob had developed for long-distance communication. The first sign of trouble came. From Shadow, whose alert posture and focused attention drew Jacob's gaze toward a cluster of cottonwood trees that marked one of the larger water sources in the area. Something there had captured the wolf's complete attention, and his body language suggested the discovery of something that required immediate human investigation. Jacob and Sarah dismounted near the trees, ground-tying their horses while the wolves led them toward whatever had triggered their concern. The scene they discovered confirmed their fears and revealed complexities that Jacob had not anticipated. The remains of a recent campsite lay scattered among the trees, abandoned hastily, but recently enough that cold ashes still marked where fires had burned. Bootprints in the soft earth around the water source told the story of multiple men and horses, more than would be expected from legitimate travelers passing through the territory. More significantly, the evidence suggested organized activity rather than casual camping. Rope marks on tree branches indicated where horses had been secured for extended periods, while the arrangement of the campsite showed planning and familiarity with the location that implied previous use. Storm's investigation led him to a torn piece of fabric caught on a low branch, evidence that someone had passed through the area quickly enough to snag expensive clothing on the rough bark. Jacob examined the material with growing concern. The cloth was fine wool, dyed deep blue, and woven with quality that indicated significant cost. This was not the practical clothing of working cowboys or traveling drifters. Someone with money was here, Sarah observed, reaching the same conclusion as she studied the fabric. Someone who doesn't usually spend time camping in rough conditions. Jacob's mind began connecting details that painted an increasingly troubling picture. The recent cattle disappearances that had been attributed to his wolves, the burned fence posts, the organized pressure from certain community members, and now evidence of well-funded strangers operating in the area suggested a conspiracy more complex than simple anti-wolf sentiment. Shadow's continuing investigation revealed additional evidence. Horse tracks leading away from the campsite showed the distinctive wear pattern of iron shoes, indicating horses that traveled regularly on hard surfaces rather than open range. More tellingly, the tracks led directly toward town rather than away from civilized areas as would be expected from rustlers or bandits. The implications were disturbing. Someone with resources and social standing was using this location as a base for activities that required concealment from legitimate authorities. The timing of the campsite's use, coinciding with the period of Jacob's troubles, suggested that his situation might be connected to larger criminal enterprises operating in the territory. "We need to tell Sheriff Morrison about this," Sarah said. Though her tone carried doubt about the effectiveness of such action, Jacob nodded, but felt uneasy about involving the sheriff in discoveries that might implicate prominent community members. Morrison was an honest man, but he was also practical, and accusations against respected citizens based on circumstantial evidence would be difficult to pursue without risking his own position. As they prepared to leave the campsite, Storm made another discovery that transformed their understanding of the situation entirely. Hidden beneath a fallen log, partially buried but still visible to the wolf's keen senses, lay a leather pouch containing gold coins and official-looking papers that suggested this was no ordinary criminal enterprise. Jacob examined the papers with growing alarm. Bills of sale for cattle-bearing brands from multiple ranches, including some he recognized as belonging to neighbors who had reported recent losses. Transportation schedules for livestock shipments to distant markets. Most disturbing, a partial list of names that included several prominent Cedar Ridge citizens. The evidence painted a picture of systematic cattle theft, organized by people with inside knowledge of ranch operations and the authority to create false documentation for stolen livestock. The operation was sophisticated enough to suggest long-term planning and coordination with corrupt officials in distant locations where the stolen cattle would be sold. "This is bigger than just rustling," Jacob said quietly, understanding that they had stumbled upon evidence of organized crime that reached far beyond his small ranch. "This involves people with real power." Sarah studied the papers with the careful attention of someone accustomed to evaluating written evidence. Her education had included enough legal training to recognize the significance of what they had discovered, and her expression reflected growing concern about their personal safety. "Jacob, if these people are willing to burn your fence and blame your wolves for their crimes, what do you think they'll do when they realize you've found their base camp?" The question carried implications that sent cold fear through Jacob's chest. Criminal enterprises of this sophistication eliminated threats to their operations with the same calculated efficiency they applied to their thefts. Discovery of their evidence made Jacob and Sarah potential threats that would require addressing through methods more permanent than harassment and intimidation. As they rode back toward Jacob's ranch with the evidence carefully concealed in Jacob's saddlebags, the wolves maintained an even higher level of alertness than before. Their behavior suggested that they sensed the increased danger that came with knowledge of criminal activities that reached into the highest levels of local society. The piece of fine blue cloth, now secured as evidence of the conspiracy, represented more than just a clue to the criminal's identity. It symbolized the dangerous intersection of legitimate society and criminal enterprise, where respectability served as camouflage for activities that threatened the safety and livelihood of honest settlers throughout the territory. Jacob realized that his fight to keep Storm and Shadow had evolved into something far more serious than a dispute about wild animals in civilized society. He was now caught in a web of organized crime that used his wolves as convenient scapegoats, while conducting operations that threatened the entire community's security and prosperity. The decision to approach Sheriff Morrison with their evidence had seemed like the only reasonable course of action, despite Jacob's growing unease about the involvement of prominent community members in the rustling operation. Morrison had always struck Jacob as an honest man, trying to maintain order in a difficult territory, and his reputation for fairness had earned him respect from ranchers and townspeople alike. Sarah accompanied Jacob to the sheriff's office on Friday morning, carrying herself with the determined composure of a woman prepared to support difficult truths with her own credibility. The evidence they had gathered at the hidden campsite filled a leather portfolio, carefully organized to present a clear picture of the organized criminal enterprise operating in their community. Morrison's office occupied the ground floor of the building that also housed the jail and the small courtroom where disputes were settled when they couldn't be resolved through informal negotiation. The sheriff greeted them with apparent warmth, offering coffee and expressing genuine concern when Jacob explained that they had discovered evidence of organized cattle rustling in the area. "I've been wondering when something like this would surface," Morrison said, settling behind his desk with the weary expression of a man who had seen too much criminal activity. "The pattern of cattle disappearances has been too organized for random rustling." Jacob spread the papers they had found across Morrison's desk, explaining the circumstances of their discovery and pointing out the significance of various documents. The sheriff examined each piece of evidence with careful attention, asking questions that demonstrated both legal knowledge and investigative experience. The forged bills of sale drew particular interest from Morrison, who studied them with the expertise of someone familiar with legitimate documentation. His reaction appeared entirely appropriate: concern about the sophistication of the operation, anger about the violation of his jurisdiction, and determination to pursue the criminals responsible. "This is excellent work," Morrison said finally, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "You've probably broken up the largest rustling operation this territory has seen in years." Sarah leaned forward, her schoolteacher's instincts alert to something in Morrison's tone that didn't match his words. "Sheriff, what's your next step?" Should we be concerned about our safety now that we've discovered their operation? Morrison's response was immediate and reassuring. I'll wire the federal marshals today and request immediate assistance. An operation this size requires resources beyond what I can handle locally. In the meantime, I'll post a deputy at your ranch, Jacob, just to make sure these criminals don't try to eliminate witnesses. The offer of protection seemed genuine and appropriate, addressing Jacob's primary concern about retaliation from criminals who now faced exposure of their entire enterprise. Morrison's quick decision to involve federal authorities suggested that he understood the seriousness of the situation and was prepared to pursue justice regardless of who might be implicated. There's one more thing, Jacob said, producing the piece of fine blue cloth that had led them to suspect the involvement of prominent community members. This was caught on a branch at their campsite. It suggests that whoever is running this operation has money and social standing. Morrison examined the cloth with the same careful attention he had given the papers, his expression thoughtful as he considered its implications. You're right. This isn't working man's clothing. We're probably dealing with someone who appears respectable to the community. The conversation continued for another half hour, with Morrison asking detailed questions about the campsite's location, the evidence of recent use, and Jacob's observations about the criminals' apparent familiarity with local ranch operations. His questions were thorough and professional, creating confidence that the investigation would be handled competently. As they prepared to leave, Morrison stood and shook hands with both Jacob and Sarah, his manner conveying gratitude for their civic responsibility and assurance that justice would be served. You've done this community a great service, he said earnestly. I'll make sure these criminals face the full consequences of their actions. Jacob and Sarah left the sheriff's office with feelings of relief and accomplishment, confident that they had successfully transferred the burden of dealing with dangerous criminals to appropriate authorities. The wolves, waiting patiently outside, seemed to sense their improved mood and fell into step beside them with relaxed attention rather than the hypervigilance that had characterized their recent behavior. Their sense of security lasted exactly 3 hours. Sarah was working in her classroom, preparing lessons for the following week, when she noticed unusual activity around the telegraph office. Deputies were coming and going with unusual frequency, and several prominent citizens had gathered in small groups on the street, their conversations animated by what appeared to be significant news, curious about developments that might relate to the rustling investigation. Sarah approached Emma Whitman, who was emerging from the telegraph office with an expression that mixed excitement with concern. Sarah, dear, have you heard the news? Emma asked, her voice carrying the breathless quality that accompanied the sharing of dramatic information. Sheriff Morrison received word that Jacob Henley has been identified as the leader of that cattle rustling ring. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, so unexpected and absurd that for a moment she couldn't process their meaning. That's impossible, Emma. Jacob was the one who brought evidence to the sheriff this morning. Emma's expression shifted to sympathetic concern, the look of someone delivering unwelcome news to a friend who didn't yet understand the situation's gravity. I know it must be shocking, dear, but apparently federal marshals have been investigating the operation for months. The evidence points directly to Jacob's ranch as the center of the whole conspiracy. Sarah's mind began racing through the implications of this impossible development. Jacob had spent the morning providing evidence of criminal activity to the sheriff, and now, hours later, he was being accused of leading the very conspiracy they had exposed. The timing was not just suspicious, it was logically impossible unless someone with authority was deliberately manipulating the investigation. Emma, I need to see that telegram, Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting information when she required it. Emma hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the request, but unable to refuse someone of Sarah's standing in the community. I suppose it wouldn't hurt, since it will be public knowledge soon enough anyway. The telegram Emma retrieved from the telegraph office appeared official and convincing at first glance. It bore the proper formatting and codes that characterized legitimate federal communications, and its language carried the formal tone of law enforcement correspondence. But Sarah's educated eye detected subtle inconsistencies that suggested careful forgery rather than authentic documentation. The spelling was too perfect, lacking the minor errors that typically appeared in hastily composed field reports. The grammar was more formal than usual federal communications, suggesting composition by someone with education rather than practical law enforcement experience. Most telling, the specific details about Jacob's alleged criminal activities were too precise and convenient, as if written by someone with intimate knowledge of local conditions rather than distant federal investigators. "Emma, when exactly did this telegram arrive?" Sarah asked, studying the document's timestamp. "About an hour ago," Emma replied. "Sheriff Morrison was waiting for it, said he expected important news about the rustling investigation." The timing confirmed Sarah's suspicions. Morrison had been expecting a telegram that would implicate Jacob in the very crimes they had helped expose that morning. The sheriff had not been surprised by the accusation. He had been prepared for it, suggesting that he had known what the message would contain before it arrived. Sarah's mind assembled the pieces of a conspiracy far more complex and dangerous than they had imagined. Morrison was not investigating the rustling operation. He was protecting it by eliminating threats to its continued success. Jacob's discovery of evidence had marked him for elimination through false accusations that would destroy his credibility and justify his removal from the community. The forged telegram represented more than just false evidence. It was a masterfully uncrafted trap designed to transform Jacob from a threat to the criminal conspiracy into its primary scapegoat. Morrison's offer of protection had been a ruse to ensure that Jacob remained available when the false accusations materialized, preventing him from escaping or hiding before the trap could be sprung. Sarah realized with growing horror that Jacob was walking into a situation where his own evidence would be used against him, where the sheriff he trusted to pursue justice was actually the criminal mastermind behind the entire operation. The wolves that had been blamed for cattle disappearances were innocent, but Jacob himself was being framed as the human leader of the conspiracy that had actually been orchestrated by the very man sworn to prevent such crimes. Racing from the telegraph office toward Jacob's ranch, Sarah understood that the blue cloth they had found at the criminal campsite had probably come from Sheriff Morrison's own clothing, left behind during his supervision of operations that he would later pretend to investigate. The sophisticated planning, the inside knowledge of ranch operations, the ability to create false documentation, all pointed to someone with law enforcement authority and community trust. The conspiracy had been perfect in its conception. Use Jacob's wolves as scapegoats for cattle theft, eliminate Jacob when he became too dangerous a witness, and maintain Morrison's reputation as the honest lawman fighting crime in his territory. Only the wolves' intelligence and Jacob's determination to prove their innocence had exposed evidence that threatened to unravel the entire operation. But Morrison had adapted quickly, transforming potential exposure into an opportunity to eliminate his primary threat through legal means that would appear entirely justified to a community already suspicious of Jacob's unusual lifestyle. The forged telegram would provide all the authority Morrison needed to arrest Jacob, seize his property, and eliminate both him and his wolves as inconvenient witnesses to criminal activities that reached into the highest levels of local law enforcement. Sarah's urgent ride to Jacob's ranch took on desperate intensity when she spotted the dust cloud approaching from the direction of town. Multiple riders moving at a determined pace could mean only one thing. Morrison was coming to execute his plan to eliminate Jacob before the truth about the rustling conspiracy could be revealed. Her horse's hooves pounded against the hard prairie, Earth as she pushed her mount to its limits, driven by the knowledge that minutes might determine whether Jacob lived or died. Jacob was working in his corral when Sarah arrived. Her horse lathered from the hard ride, and her face flushed with exertion and fear. Storm and Shadow immediately sensed her distress, positioning themselves alertly as she dismounted and ran toward Jacob with urgent news that would shatter his remaining assumptions about safety and justice. "Jacob, it's Morrison!" she gasped, struggling to catch her breath while conveying information that couldn't wait for recovery. "He's the one behind the rustling. The telegram accusing you is a forgery, and he's coming here with deputies to arrest you for crimes he committed himself." The words hit Jacob like cold water, forcing him to immediately reassess everything he thought he understood about his situation. Morrison's helpful concern, his promise to contact federal authorities, his offer of protection, all had been calculated deception designed to keep Jacob available for elimination when the time was right. "How long do we have?" Jacob asked, his mind already shifting from shock to survival planning. "Maybe 20 minutes, Sarah replied, checking the horizon where dust clouds marked the approaching riders. "Jacob, we have to get out of here. If Morrison arrests you on false charges, you'll never live to see trial." Jacob's gaze moved to Storm and Shadow, who had picked up on the tension and were displaying the alert posture that indicated their readiness for conflict. These wolves had become his family, his responsibility, and his most reliable allies. Running would mean abandoning them to certain death and leaving Morrison free to continue his criminal operations with impunity. "I'm not running," Jacob said quietly, the decision crystallizing in his mind with absolute clarity. "This is my home, and Morrison has already taken too much from too many people. Someone needs to make a stand." Sarah stared at him with a mixture of admiration and terror. "Jacob, you can't fight the sheriff and his deputies. It's suicide." "Not if we're smart about it," Jacob replied, his tone carrying the calm certainty of a man who had found his purpose in desperate circumstances. "Storm and Shadow aren't just pets, Sarah. They're wolves, with all the intelligence and instincts that implies. If we work together, we might have advantages that Morrison hasn't considered." Jacob's military service during the Indian Wars had taught him tactical thinking that he hadn't needed to use for years, but had never forgotten. Outnumbered fighters could prevail through superior positioning, better knowledge of terrain, and coordinated action that maximized their strengths while exploiting enemy weaknesses. Moving quickly around his ranch, Jacob began implementing a defense strategy that incorporated the wolves' natural abilities with his own knowledge of firearms and tactics. He retrieved his father's Winchester from above the fireplace, checking its action and loading it with the careful efficiency of someone whose life depended on mechanical reliability. "Sarah, I need you to ride back toward town, but not into it," Jacob instructed, his voice carrying the authority of command, while his hands performed the practiced motions of preparation. "Find a safe position where you can observe what happens here, and if things go badly, ride directly to the federal courthouse in Helena. Tell them everything we've discovered about Morrison's operation." Sarah's face showed her reluctance to leave him facing such overwhelming odds, but she understood the logic of preserving at least one witness who could expose Morrison's corruption if Jacob's desperate gamble failed. Her schoolteacher's practical mind recognized that someone needed to survive to tell the truth, regardless of personal wishes to stand and fight alongside him. Jacob knelt in the dirt near his corral and began sketching a tactical plan that would coordinate his actions with the wolves' instinctive behaviors. Using his finger to draw lines and positions in the earth, he created a map that showed how 3 defenders could create the illusion of greater numbers while utilizing cover and concealment to neutralize superior firepower. The plan relied on Storm's protective instincts and aggressive nature to create distraction and confusion among the attacking force. Storm would position himself in the rocks above the main approach to the ranch house, using his natural camouflage and silent movement to appear suddenly where enemies least expected, drawing their attention and fire away from Jacob's primary position. Shadow's role would be more subtle but equally crucial. His ability to move unseen would allow him to approach enemies from unexpected angles, using his intelligence to identify the most dangerous threats and neutralize them through surprise attacks that would demoralize and scatter the remaining opposition. Jacob would anchor the defense from a prepared position behind his house, where stone foundations and thick timber would provide protection from gunfire while offering clear fields of fire across the approaches to his property. His father's rifle, with its accuracy and range, would allow him to engage enemies at distances that would minimize their advantages in numbers and coordination. The wolves understood the concept of coordinated hunting from their instinctive pack behavior, and Jacob had learned to communicate with them through signals and commands that would remain effective even in the chaos of combat. His whistle would coordinate their movements, while hand signals would direct their actions when sound might compromise their positions. As Jacob refined his battle plan, Storm and Shadow seemed to sense the approaching conflict with increasing intensity. Their behavior shifted from normal alertness to the focused attention of predators preparing for a hunt. They positioned themselves according to Jacob's directions, demonstrating their understanding of tactical concepts that went beyond simple obedience to encompass genuine cooperation in defensive strategy. Sarah's departure left Jacob alone with his unlikely allies as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The approaching dust cloud had resolved into individual riders, now close enough to identify. Sheriff Morrison leading 4 deputies, all armed and riding with the determined purpose of men executing what they believed to be a routine arrest of a dangerous criminal. Jacob used the remaining time to position supplies and ammunition where they would be accessible during the fight, creating redundant positions that would allow him to continue resistance even if his primary defensive position was compromised. He scattered spare ammunition in concealed locations, positioned water and medical supplies where they could be reached safely, and prepared signal fires that could alert distant neighbors if the battle turned against him. The tactical situation was desperate but not hopeless. Morrison's confidence in his false charges would make him careless, expecting Jacob to surrender peacefully rather than resist with lethal force. The sheriff's experience with law enforcement had not prepared him for military-style defense by coordinated opponents who understood both terrain and tactical cooperation. Most importantly, Morrison had no knowledge of the wolves' true capabilities or their bond with Jacob. He expected to face one man with civilian weapons and limited tactical training, not a coordinated pack that combined human intelligence with wolf instincts and natural advantages in stealth and surprise attack. As the approaching riders drew closer, Jacob took his position behind the stone foundation that would serve as his primary fighting position. Storm disappeared into the rocky outcropping above the main approach, his dark coat blending perfectly with shadows cast by the late afternoon sun. Shadow vanished entirely, becoming invisible through natural camouflage abilities that would allow him to strike from unexpected directions when the moment was right. The battle plan drawn in the dirt showed how 3 defenders could create crossfires that would force attackers into exposed positions while maintaining protected avenues of retreat. If withdrawal became necessary, Jacob's military experience had taught him that defensive victories were won through patience and discipline, allowing the enemy to commit to disadvantageous positions before revealing the true strength of prepared defenses. Morrison's voice carried across the prairie as the riders approached the final approach to Jacob's ranch house, his tone carrying the authority of law enforcement conducting official business rather than the uncertainty of criminals executing a dangerous elimination of witnesses. "Jacob Henley, this is Sheriff Morrison. You're under arrest for cattle rustling and conspiracy. Come out with your hands visible and surrender peacefully." Jacob's response was silence, allowing Morrison to interpret his lack of cooperation as fear or defiance rather than tactical preparation. The sheriff's next moves would reveal his true intentions and provide Jacob with the justification he needed to defend himself with lethal force against corrupt law enforcement. The sun continued its descent, casting longer shadows that would favor defenders who understood how to use concealment and terrain to their advantage. Storm and Shadow remained invisible but alert, waiting for Jacob's signal to begin coordinated action that would transform a routine arrest into a battle for survival that would expose Morrison's criminal conspiracy to the entire territory. Jacob's finger traced the battle plan one final time, memorizing positions and contingencies that might determine whether justice would prevail over corruption in the remote Montana territory. The outcome would depend on tactical skill, courage under fire, and the extraordinary bond between one man and two wolves who had chosen to stand together against overwhelming odds in defense of truth and home. The attack began with Sheriff Morrison's calculated escalation from official authority to lethal force, revealing his true intentions when Jacob failed to surrender, as expected. Morrison had positioned his deputies in a semicircle around the ranch house, creating what appeared to be a standard law enforcement containment, while actually preparing for an execution that would eliminate the primary threat to his criminal enterprise. "Last warning, Henley," Morrison shouted, his voice carrying across the distance between the approaching riders and Jacob's defensive position. "Come out now, or we'll come in after you. And there's no guarantee you'll survive resisting arrest." Jacob's continued silence transformed Morrison's pretense of legal procedure into open hostility. The sheriff drew his weapon and signaled his deputies to advance, abandoning any pretense that this was a peaceful arrest in favor of the violent resolution he had planned from the beginning. The first shot came from Deputy Wheeler, whose nervous energy had been building throughout the approach to Jacob's ranch. Wheeler fired into the air, ostensibly as a warning shot, but actually as the signal that marked the beginning of coordinated assault. The sound echoed across the prairie like thunder, announcing to anyone within miles that the confrontation had moved beyond words into deadly action. Jacob's response was immediate and precise. His father's Winchester spoke with authority that had been earned through years of frontier experience, the bullet finding its target with accuracy that demonstrated military training and steady nerves under combat stress. Wheeler's hat flew from his head, the near miss serving as Jacob's own warning that resistance would be serious and potentially lethal. Morrison's reaction revealed his true character when faced with unexpected opposition. Instead of attempting to de-escalate or negotiate, he immediately ordered his deputies to advance and use whatever force was necessary to eliminate Jacob as a threat. His commands carried the tone of a military operation rather than law enforcement, confirming that this had always been intended as an execution rather than an arrest. The deputies spread out and began their advance, using available cover while maintaining coordinated movement that suggested prior planning for exactly this scenario. Their actions were too smooth and professional to be improvised responses to unexpected resistance. Morrison had prepared his men for the possibility that Jacob might fight rather than surrender to false charges. Storm struck first, appearing suddenly from the rocky outcropping with the silent efficiency that characterized wolf hunting behavior. His target was Deputy Collins, who had positioned himself on the left flank of the advancing line and was concentrating on Jacob's last known position rather than watching for threats from above. The wolf's attack was precisely calculated to maximize psychological impact while minimizing actual harm to a man who might be an honest deputy following orders rather than a willing participant in Morrison's conspiracy. Storm's weight and momentum knocked Collins from his feet, while his growling and snapping created terror without inflicting serious injury. demonstrating the intelligence that allowed him to distinguish between different levels of threat. Collins's screams of fear and confusion shattered the deputies' coordinated advance, forcing them to confront the reality that they faced more than one opponent in terrain that offered advantages to defenders who understood how to use natural cover and concealment. Morrison's carefully planned assault dissolved into chaos as his men struggled to identify and respond to threats that appeared from unexpected directions. Jacob used the distraction created by Storm's attack to shift positions, moving from his initial defensive position to a secondary location that offered different angles of fire while maintaining protection from return shots. His movement was covered by the confusion surrounding Storm's assault, allowing him to appear suddenly from a new direction with his rifle trained on Morrison himself. "Sheriff!" Jacob called out, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield despite the continuing chaos caused by Storm's harassment of the scattered deputies. "Call off your men, and we can settle this between us." Morrison's response was a gunshot aimed at Jacob's voice rather than his visible position, the hasty shot revealing panic beneath his facade of control. The bullet splintered wood near Jacob's head, close enough to demonstrate serious intent to kill, but inaccurate enough to show that Morrison's nerves were affecting his marksmanship. Shadow chose that moment to demonstrate his own contribution to the coordinated defense, appearing silently behind Deputy Martinez, who had taken cover behind Jacob's water trough. The wolf's presence was announced by a low growl that froze Martinez with terror, his weapon forgotten as he faced the reality of predatory intelligence focused entirely on him as potential prey. The psychological effect of facing wolves in combat proved more devastating to the attacking force than Jacob had anticipated. Trained to fight human opponents with predictable behaviors and conventional weapons, the deputies found themselves confronting adversaries whose movements and tactics operated outside normal experience and preparation. Morrison began shouting, orders intended to restore discipline and coordination to his scattered force, but his commands revealed growing desperation rather than tactical control. His carefully planned elimination of Jacob had become a chaotic battle against opponents who refused to follow the script he had prepared. Jacob's tactical plan was working exactly as he had drawn it in the dirt. Storm creating distraction and confusion on the left flank, Shadow neutralizing threats through psychological pressure and the implicit threat of attack, while Jacob himself maintained disciplined fire from protected positions that forced the attackers to expose themselves while attempting to locate and engage him. The battle's first phase established that Morrison's numerical advantage would not guarantee victory against defenders who understood both terrain and coordinated tactics. The Wolves had transformed a 5-against-1 assault into a complex engagement where superior numbers became a liability rather than an asset, as deputies found themselves unable to distinguish between human and animal threats while maintaining effective offensive action. Morrison's growing anger and desperation suggested that his next escalation would be more dangerous and potentially decisive. As the man accustomed to control faced the unraveling of carefully laid plans through the intervention of adversaries he had never anticipated or prepared to face, Morrison's desperation transformed him from calculating criminal to dangerous wild man as his carefully orchestrated plan crumbled into chaos around him. The sheriff abandoned his position behind the wagon that had served as mobile command post and began advancing directly toward Jacob's defensive position, firing rapidly and wildly while screaming orders that his scattered deputies could no longer coordinate effectively. "Enough of this!" Morrison roared, his voice cracking with rage and frustration. "He's just one man with a couple of animals. Take him down now, or I'll have you all charged with cowardice." But Morrison's deputies had lost their stomach for a fight that had already exceeded their expectations and capabilities. Deputy Collins remained pinned behind inadequate cover by Storm's continued harassment, too terrified to move, while the wolf maintained psychological pressure through strategic appearances and threatening growls. Martinez had abandoned his weapon entirely and was attempting to retreat from Shadow's silent stalking, his nerves shattered by the experience of being hunted by an intelligent predator. Only Deputy Wheeler maintained any semblance of tactical effectiveness, and even he was showing signs of panic as he fired at shadows and sounds rather than identified targets. The coordinated advance had become individual survival efforts as each man struggled to deal with threats that appeared and disappeared with supernatural stealth. Jacob recognized the moment when tactical advantage could be pressed into decisive victory. Morrison's advance had separated him from his remaining effective support, creating an opportunity for the kind of direct confrontation that would settle the conflict permanently. Rising from his covered position, Jacob stepped into full view, with his rifle trained steadily on the advancing sheriff. "That's far enough, Morrison," Jacob called out, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who held tactical superiority despite being outnumbered. "Drop your weapon and surrender. It's over." Morrison's response revealed the depths of his corruption and desperation. Instead of acknowledging defeat, he raised his pistol toward Jacob while simultaneously reaching for the deputy's badge that hung from his vest. In one swift motion, he tore the badge free and hurled it toward Jacob's feet, his voice rising to a scream that carried across the battlefield. "I am the law in this territory," Morrison shouted, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. "I decide who lives and dies, not some nobody rancher with his pet wolves." The sheriff's final words were interrupted by Storm's decisive intervention. The wolf had been circling through the rocks above the confrontation, waiting for the perfect moment to strike with maximum effect. Morrison's exposed position and complete focus on Jacob created exactly the opportunity Storm needed to end the threat permanently. Storm's attack was swift, silent, and devastating. The wolf launched himself from the rocky outcropping with precise timing that brought him down directly onto Morrison's back, the impact driving the sheriff to the ground while powerful jaws closed around his gun arm, preventing any possibility of a final shot that might still change the battle's outcome. Morrison's scream of pain and terror echoed across the prairie as he found himself pinned beneath 120 pounds of protective wolf whose loyalty to Jacob had transformed him from domestic companion into deadly guardian. Storm's growl carried a primal warning that penetrated Morrison's rage and replaced it with the pure fear of prey facing a natural predator. "Call him off!" Morrison gasped, his voice high with panic as he felt Storm's teeth against his throat. "Please call him off." Jacob approached the pinned sheriff with careful steps, his rifle ready but no longer necessary, as the immediate threat had been neutralized by Storm's perfect execution of coordinated pack tactics. Shadow materialized from concealment to flank, Morrison from the opposite side, completing the wolves' demonstration of how teamwork could overcome superior numbers and firepower. "Storm, easy," Jacob commanded, his voice carrying the calm authority that had developed through months of training and mutual trust. "Hold him, but don't hurt him unless he moves." The wolf's response demonstrated the intelligence and discipline that had made their partnership so effective. Storm maintained his dominant position over Morrison while reducing the pressure of his jaws, holding the sheriff motionless without causing additional injury, but clearly prepared to respond with lethal force if Morrison attempted any resistance. Tikar, remaining deputies, witnessing their leader's defeat and understanding that continued resistance was futile, began laying down their weapons and raising their hands in surrender. Collins emerged shakily from his cover, with his hands visible and empty, while Martinez and Wheeler followed his example, their faces showing relief that the terrifying confrontation was finally ending. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of reinforcements, but these riders carried the distinctive appearance of federal marshals rather than additional local law enforcement. Sarah's desperate ride to alert higher authorities had succeeded in bringing legitimate legal assistance that would ensure Morrison's capture and prosecution rather than his escape through local corruption. Marshal Thompson, leading 3 additional federal officers, surveyed the scene with professional assessment that quickly identified the essential facts. Morrison pinned beneath a protective wolf, his deputies surrendering, and Jacob standing with weapon ready but not threatening the defeated criminals. "Are you Jacob Henley?" Thompson called out as he dismounted, his hand resting casually on his weapon but not drawing it in a gesture that indicated official authority without immediate hostility. "I am," Jacob replied, maintaining his position over Morrison, while Storm continued to hold the sheriff motionless. "Miss Mitchell reached us with evidence of corruption and rustling conspiracy," Thompson explained, producing documents that included the genuine federal investigation that had been running parallel to Morrison's criminal activities. "We've been tracking this operation for months, waiting for evidence that would allow us to move against local law enforcement." Morrison's badge lay in the dirt where he had thrown it during his final desperate assault, its metal surface reflecting the last rays of sunlight in a symbol of authority that had been corrupted and ultimately defeated by the coordinated action of one honest man and 2 loyal wolves who had refused to abandon their chosen family in the face of overwhelming odds. The battle was over, but the victory belonged not just to Jacob, but to the principle that justice could prevail over corruption when courage and intelligence worked together against those who abused their power for personal gain. 3 weeks after the confrontation that exposed Sheriff Morrison's criminal conspiracy, Jacob sat on his front porch, watching Storm and Shadow play in the yard with a contentment he had never expected to feel again. His left shoulder still ached from the bullet wound he had sustained during the final moments of the battle, but Sarah's careful nursing had ensured that the injury healed cleanly without permanent damage to his ability to work his ranch. The federal investigation had revealed the full scope of Morrison's rustling operation, involving corrupt officials in 3 territories and stolen cattle worth more than $50,000 over 2 years of organized criminal activity. The evidence Jacob and Sarah had discovered at the hidden campsite had provided the final pieces needed to prosecute not just Morrison, but his entire network of accomplices, including several prominent ranchers who had used their respectable positions to provide cover for systematic theft from their neighbors. Deputy Wheeler had been cleared of criminal charges after his testimony revealed that Morrison had coerced his participation through threats against his family, but Collins and Martinez now faced federal prosecution for their willing involvement in the conspiracy. The distinction between willing criminals and intimidated accomplices had been carefully drawn by federal prosecutors who understood the complexities of frontier law enforcement, where personal loyalties often conflicted with legal obligations. The community's transformation had been as dramatic as it was swift. Martha Prescott, whose husband had been implicated in the rustling conspiracy and was now awaiting trial in federal custody, had publicly apologized to Jacob and offered to purchase additional land that would expand his ranch to economically viable proportions. Her gesture represented more than personal atonement. It symbolized the community's recognition that they had misjudged both Jacob and his unusual companions. Reverend Patterson had delivered a sermon about the nature of judgment and the danger of condemning what was unfamiliar, using Jacob's situation as an example of how fear could blind people to truth and justice. His words had resonated with congregation members who remembered their own participation in the campaign against Jacob's wolves, leading to a community-wide reflection on the difference between genuine threats and imagined dangers. Dr. Matthews, had become fascinated by the wolves' intelligence and protective behavior, documenting their responses and capabilities in letters to colleagues in Eastern universities who were studying animal behavior and intelligence. His scientific interest had helped legitimize Storm and Shadow's presence in the community by framing their unique qualities as subjects worthy of scholarly attention rather than objects of fear and suspicion. The new sheriff, appointed by federal authorities pending local elections, was Thomas Crawford, a former Army officer whose experience with frontier conditions and military discipline had prepared him for the complexities of law enforcement in territory where federal, territorial, and local jurisdictions often overlapped in confusing ways. Crawford's first official act had been to deputize Jacob as an honorary member of local law enforcement, recognizing his service to the community and his demonstrated ability to handle dangerous situations with sound judgment. The formal document, creating Jacob's honorary deputy status, had been incorporated into a new town charter that explicitly recognized Storm and Shadow as official protectors of Cedar Ridge, with legal standing that prevented future attempts to remove them based on species prejudice rather than actual behavior. The charter represented unprecedented legal recognition of the bond between human and animal partners in frontier law enforcement. Sarah's role in exposing the conspiracy had elevated her status in the community from respected schoolteacher to acknowledged heroine whose courage and intelligence had saved Cedar Ridge from continued exploitation by criminal elements. Her classroom had become a gathering place for community discussions about governance and justice, as parents recognized that education extended beyond basic literacy to include the critical thinking skills that had enabled Sarah to recognize Morrison's deception when others had accepted it without question. The growing relationship between Jacob and Sarah had become a source of gentle community speculation and approval, as neighbors who had once viewed Jacob with suspicion now saw him as a hero whose unconventional path had led to extraordinary service on behalf of everyone's security and prosperity. Their courtship proceeded with the careful consideration of mature adults who understood the importance of building partnership on solid foundations of shared values and mutual respect. Storm and Shadow had adapted to their new status as community protectors with dignity that impressed even former skeptics. They accompanied Jacob on his deputy duties, providing security during court proceedings and investigations, while maintaining the disciplined behavior that had convinced federal marshals of their reliability as partners in law enforcement activities. The wolves' acceptance by the children of Cedar Ridge had been particularly complete and touching. Sarah's students had written essays about courage and loyalty, inspired by Storm and Shadow's defense of their home, while younger children had begun including wolves in their games as protective figures rather than threatening monsters. Jacob's ranch had prospered beyond his wildest expectations, as federal rewards for exposing the rustling conspiracy combined with community support to provide financial security that allowed him to focus on improvements rather than mere survival. His cattle herd had grown through purchases made possible by reward money, while his reputation for honesty and reliability had attracted business opportunities that leveraged his unique position in the community. The evening routine that had become precious to Jacob involved walking his property boundaries with Storm and Shadow, checking on livestock and fences while enjoying the peaceful satisfaction of work well done and home well protected. These walks had become meditation time, allowing him to reflect on the journey that had transformed him from isolated bachelor to respected community leader, through the simple act of showing kindness to creatures in need. As autumn approached, and the anniversary of Storm and Shadow's arrival in his life neared, Jacob often found himself marveling at the unexpected directions that compassionate choices could take. His decision to save 2 orphaned wolf pups had led to challenges he had never imagined, but also to rewards that exceeded anything he might have planned for his solitary life. The bonds forged through hardship and danger had created a family that transcended traditional definitions, proving that love and loyalty could bridge any gap between different species or different dreams. Standing on his porch with Sarah's hand in his and watching Storm and Shadow explore their secure territory, Jacob understood that sometimes the most profound transformations began with the smallest acts of kindness toward those who needed protection most.